She was 19 years old, and she had been left for dead on the trail, and when this story begins, she was crawling. Her name was Clara Denton, and 2 days before, her uncle's hired man had ridden off and left her afoot and alone in the high dry country of the Nevada Territory, with no horse, no water, and no way home. And it had not been an accident. It had been meant. Her uncle, a man named Warren Denton, had sent her out from the ranch on an errand that had no purpose but to get her onto an empty stretch of trail, and the hired man had done what he was paid to do, which was to see that she did not come back. He had taken her horse and her canteen and ridden away, and he had not even troubled to look ashamed. And Clara Denton had been left standing in 40 miles of nothing with the sun coming up hard, and she had understood, watching the dust of him go, exactly what her uncle intended, and exactly why. But Warren Denton had made one mistake, which was that he had underestimated his brother's daughter, as he had underestimated his brother before her. Clara did not lie down and die. She walked. She walked the way her father had taught her to move in dry country, which she had thought at the time was only a father's idle lore, and now understood was the difference between living and dying. She walked in the cool and rested in the heat, for a body loses its water fastest laboring under the noon sun, and a person who walks in the middle of a desert day is a person spending their life faster than they have to. She kept her mouth shut and breathed through her nose, for her father had told her that a man loses water with every panting breath, and that the desert kills the ones who gulp at the air. She did not eat, though her belly cramped, for she had no water to spare on digesting food, and food without water only hastens the end. She kept off the high bare ground where the sun could reach her from every side, and followed the low ways, the dry washes and the shade of the cutbanks, and when the worst heat came, she lay in the black shade of an overhung rock, and did not move and did not sleep, only waited, counting her own slow heartbeats, until the sun tipped over, and the shadows came long and blue, and she could go on. It was her father walking her out of that desert, though he was 2 years dead. Everything she knew that kept her alive, he had given her. And she thought of that as she walked, and it was a strange bitter comfort that the brother Warren had murdered was, even from the grave, defeating him. It was her father walking her out of that desert, though he was 2 years dead. Everything she knew that kept her alive, he had given her, and she thought of that as she walked, and it was a strange bitter comfort that the brother Warren had murdered was, even from the grave, defeating him. She went not the way home, which was too far, but toward the old wagon road her father had shown her as a child, the one that led to the dead town of Contention. Because a road, even a dead one, goes somewhere, and where there had been a town there might be water. And on the second day, near the end of her strength, her lips cracked and her tongue swollen, she came down off the high ground and saw below her, in a dry fold of the hills, the gray-weathered buildings of Contention, the mining town that had died 40 years before. And she went down to it on her hands and knees at the last, crawling, and that is where this story truly begins. Contention had been a silver town once, and a rich one, and then the vein had pinched out, and the town had died all at once the way mining towns do, and 40 years of desert sun had bleached its empty buildings gray and filled its one street with tumbleweed and left it to the lizards. Clara Denton crawled into the shade of the first building she reached and lay there a long while, and then she made herself get up. Because a person dying of thirst in a dead town does not have the luxury of rest, and she went looking, building to building, for water, and it was in the looking for water that she found, instead, the thing that would save her life in a way she could not yet imagine, and would give her back everything her uncle had stolen. She found a well behind the old Assay office, and there was water in it, bad and warm and alive with things, but water, and she drank and was sick and drank again and lived. And when the worst of the thirst had passed and she could think again, she looked at the building the well stood behind, and she saw that it was different from the other dead buildings of Contention. It was built of stone, not wood, low and thick-walled, and it had an iron door, and the iron door was sealed, not locked. Sealed, the way a thing is sealed that someone meant to keep shut forever, the frame of it mortared round with a band of cement, gone hard as the stone itself, and a sign above it, barely readable under 40 years of dust, that said Assay Office. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara Denton, and the sealed Assay Office in the dead town of Contention, and the ledger she found inside it that brought down the man who had left her to die. And if a story of survival and hard-won justice is what you came for tonight, light a lantern with us, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where in this wide country you are watching from. We are always glad of the company here in the dark. To understand what the sealed Assay Office meant and why Clara's heart moved strangely when she saw it, you have to understand what her uncle had done and how she came to be his to dispose of. Clara Denton was the daughter of a good man and the niece of a bad one. Her father, Amos Denton, and her uncle, Warren, had come west together as young men and had built, together, the Denton Ranch, a good spread of range and water in a dry country where water was everything. But the two brothers were not alike. Amos was the elder, the steady one. The one with the eye for land and the patience to build. Warren was the younger, the charming one. The one who spent and schemed and always felt himself owed more than he had. The ranch had prospered under Amos's hand, and the deed to it and to the precious water rights that made it worth anything had been in Amos's name, for it was Amos who had filed the claims and done the work, and Warren had been, in truth, a junior partner who had never quite forgiven his brother for being the one the land belonged to. Then, 2 years before this story begins, Amos Denton had died. He had died suddenly, of what the doctor called his heart, though he had been a strong man, not old. And he had died at a convenient time, which was just after he had quarreled openly with Warren about the running of the ranch and just before he could do anything about it. And when the dust settled, it was found that the deed and the water rights had passed not to Amos's daughter Clara, his only child as everyone had expected, but to Warren, the brother, on the strength of a document that Warren produced, a partnership agreement in Amos's own hand that gave the whole of the ranch to the surviving brother upon the death of either, cutting out all heirs. Clara had never believed it. She had known her father, and she knew he would have died 100 times over before he cut his own daughter out of her inheritance and left her dependent on Warren, whom Amos had trusted less each passing year. But the document was in her father's hand, or seemed to be, and it was witnessed, and Clara was 17 and powerless. And the law saw a properly executed agreement and a grieving brother, and it gave Warren Denton the ranch, and it gave Clara Denton to Warren as a ward, a poor relation eating at his table on his sufferance, in the house that should have been hers. She had lived 2 years like that, watching the man she was near certain had murdered her father sit in her father's chair, and she had been careful and quiet, and she had watched, because she was Amos Denton's daughter and she had his patience. And she had begun, in that quiet watching, to be dangerous to Warren. For she had started asking questions, careful ones, about the partnership document, about where it had been drawn and witnessed, about a discrepancy she had noticed in its dates, and Warren Denton, who had gotten away with one killing, had decided that his brother's watchful daughter had become a risk he would not carry, and so he had arranged the errand, and the empty trail, and the hired man who rode away. That was the thing Clara carried into the dead town of Contention, the near certainty that her father had been murdered and her inheritance stolen by a forged document, and no proof of any of it, and an uncle who had just tried to have her killed and would surely try again. She had nothing. And then she stood in the dead street and looked at a sealed Assay Office, and something her father had told her long ago stirred in her memory. For Amos Denton had known Contention. In his young days, before the town died, he had done business there, and he had told Clara stories of it when she was small, and one of those stories came back to her now with the force of a thing meant. He had told her that the Assay Office of a mining town was the most important building in it, more than the bank, more than the sheriff's, because the assayer was the man who weighed and tested and recorded the worth of every ounce of ore and every claim in the district, and his records, his assay books and his ledgers, were the true history of the town's wealth, kept in his own hand and trusted by everyone, because an assayer who lied did not stay an assayer long. And he had told her one thing more, a small thing she had not thought of in years, that when the town of Contention died, the assayer had sealed his office, mortared the door shut with his records inside, because there had been some trouble, some dispute over the last claims that had never been settled, and the assayer had wanted his books kept safe and untampered until the law could sort it out, and then the town had died entirely, and the law had never come, and the office had simply stayed sealed, forgotten for 40 years. Clara Denton stood before that sealed iron door in the killing heat with her life half spent, and she thought records, kept safe, untampered in the assayer's own trusted hand. And she thought of the forged partnership document that had stolen her inheritance, and of how she had no sample of any disputed thing to prove a forgery against, and she began to understand, dimly at first and then with a rising certainty, that the answer to her uncle might be sealed behind that door, if only she could get it open. The getting of it open was the work of 3 days, and Clara did it half-starved and alone, and she did it with patience and with her hands, and with the tools the dead town gave her. She did not have the strength to break the iron door, and she would not have wanted to, for she had begun to think like her father now, carefully, and she understood that whatever was inside must be reached without being harmed. So she studied the seal. The door itself was iron and sound, but the seal that held it, the band of old cement mortared round the frame, was the weak point, for cement grows brittle with the years and 40 years of desert heat and cold, of the stone expanding by day and contracting by night, had crazed the old mortar through with hairline cracks. She saw at once that this was not work she could do by strength, for she had almost none left, and a starved and thirsting body cannot swing a sledge for long. So she did it the way her father would have done any hard thing, by letting patience do what force could not. She read the seal like a claim, studying where the desert had already begun the work for her, finding the hairline cracks that ran through the brittle cement, and understanding that if she opened those cracks a little at a time, following where the years had led, the seal would come apart along its own weaknesses far more easily than she could ever have broken it fresh. Clara found, among the dead buildings, the tools of the town's abandonment, a rusted miner's pick, a broken chisel, a hand sledge with a split handle she bound up with strips of her own petticoat. And with these, over 3 days, resting in the heat and working in the cool, drinking the bad water and eating the little she could find, a few withered mesquite beans. A lizard she caught and cooked over a fire of dry brush, she worked at the brittle seal. She worked in short spells, for that was all her strength allowed, chipping the old cement away from the door's edge a crumbling inch at a time, setting the point of the chisel into a crack the years had made and tapping it gentle with the sledge, letting the desert's own slow work help her, resting between spells in the shade with her back against the cool stone of the office wall. There were hours when she doubted she had the strength to finish, when the sledge seemed too heavy to lift and the seal too long to ever come apart. But she thought of her uncle in her father's chair, and of the hired man riding away without even the grace to look ashamed, and the anger of it put a little strength back in her arms, and she went on. On the 3rd day the last of the seal gave way, and the iron door, freed of the cement that had held it 40 years, groaned open on its rusted hinges into the dark. The inside of the assay office was dry and dim and untouched, sealed against the desert for 40 years, and it was as the assayer had left it. There was the assay furnace, cold these 40 years. There were the delicate scales under their glass, for weighing gold to the grain. There were the shelves of labeled ore samples, and the cabinets, and there, on the desk where the assayer had left them, wrapped against the dust, were the books. The assay ledgers of the Contention district. 40 years of the true recorded history of the town's wealth in the assayer's own careful, trusted, untampered hand. Clara did not, at first, know what she was looking for. She had come to the door on an instinct, a desperate reaching, and it was only now, turning the pages of the old ledgers by the light from the open door, that she began to understand what she had actually found. For the Assay ledgers were not only records of war, they were records of men. Every claim in the district, every sale, every transfer of a mine or a share had passed through the assay office and been recorded and witnessed, for the assayer had also served, as assayers often did in a town with no other trusted officer, as a kind of recorder and notary, and his books held the signatures, dated and witnessed, of every man who had done business in contention for the 20 years of its life. And among those men, Clara found, as she searched with a wild and rising hope, going back to the years before she was born, was a young man newly come west, doing his first business in the mining country, signing his name again and again in the assayer's ledger. Warren Denton. Her uncle had been in contention as a young man. He had bought and sold claims there in the town's last years, before he and her father had gone on to build the ranch, and every transaction he had made, he had signed, and every signature had been recorded and witnessed and dated in the assayer's untampered book, and preserved, sealed, dry for 40 years. Clara Denton was holding 40-year-old samples of her uncle's genuine signature, dozens of them, dated and proven, kept perfect behind a sealed door since before the forgery was ever dreamed of. She sat down on the dusty floor of the assay office with the ledger open in her lap, there in the dim light from the open door, and for a long moment she could not breathe. She understood exactly what she held. She had spent 2 years unable to prove the partnership document a forgery for one simple reason. To prove a signature forged, you must have genuine signatures to set beside it, true samples of the hand the forger imitated, and Warren had been careful, over the years, to leave few examples of his own hand about, and none from the distant past that a forgery could be measured against. He had guarded his signature the way a careful criminal does, but he had not known, could not have known, that 40 years before, as a heedless young man, he had scattered his genuine signature a dozen times through a book that would be sealed in stone and kept perfect in the desert dark until the very day his brother's daughter needed it. The one proof he could never have destroyed was the one he had forgotten he ever made. And more than that, as she searched the ledgers, she found the thing that turned her survival into a reckoning. For among Warren Denton's transactions in contention, recorded plainly in the assayer's hand, was the truth of how Warren had gotten his start, the seed of the man he became. He had, in contention, in his young days, done exactly the thing he would do again to his brother 40 years later. He had cheated a partner. There was recorded in the ledger a dispute, the very dispute over the last claims that had caused the assayer to seal his office, and at the center of it was young Warren Denton, who had produced a document transferring a dead partner's share to himself, a document the other claimants swore was forged, and the assayer, an honest man, had sealed his books with the evidence of the dispute inside precisely so that the forgery could one day be proven, and then the town had died before it could be. Warren Denton had escaped his first forgery only because a town died. And now, 40 years later, his brother's daughter, left to die in the desert, had crawled into that same dead town and opened that same sealed door and found both the proof of his first crime and the genuine signatures that would prove his last. Clara Denton walked out of the dead town of contention alive, carrying the assay ledgers wrapped in sacking, and it took her 2 more days to reach the living world, following the old wagon road until it met a traveled one. And she was found at last, sunburned and starved and half dead but walking, by a freight teamster who gave her water and carried her to the county seat. And there, Clara Denton did not go to the local sheriff, who was her uncle's friend, but past him, to the district court and the federal authority that oversaw the territory's land and mineral records. And she laid before them the assay ledgers of contention, and she told her whole story, the murder she believed in but could not prove, the forged partnership document that had stolen her inheritance, and the errand that had left her for dead in the desert. At first, as always in these stories, she was only a ragged girl with a wild tale. The clerk who first received her looked at the sunburned, sun-blistered girl in her ruined dress with her bundle of old books and very nearly sent her away. But she would not be sent away. She had crawled through a desert and a sealed door and 2 more days of walking, and she had a stillness in her now. The stillness of a person who has already survived the worst and cannot be frightened by a clerk, and she asked, quietly and clearly, for the one man in the district whose business was land and mineral records and who owed nothing to Warren Denton. And she kept asking until she was brought to him. And she had the ledgers, and the ledgers were real, and they were, to the men whose business was such things, a treasure of a very particular kind. For here were 40-year-old, sealed, witnessed, indisputable samples of Warren Denton's genuine signature, and when they were set beside the signature on the partnership document that had given Warren the ranch, the forgery came apart. It did not come apart all at once, for these things are done carefully, by men who know that a fortune and a life hang on their judgment. A document examiner was sent for from the state capitol, a patient specialist in the reading of hands, and he laid the forged partnership agreement beside the assayer's genuine dated samples and studied them for many days. A man's hand changes over 40 years, but its deep habits do not, the unconscious turns and pressures a person is not even aware they make. And the examiner could show where the forger, imitating Amos Denton's hand on the partnership document, had betrayed himself in exactly those small, unconscious ways a forger always does, letting his own habits bleed through the hand he copied. And the assayer's sealed samples let him prove it, for they gave him the true measure of both brothers' hands from the years before any forgery, a baseline that could not have been faked because it had been sealed in stone before the crime was conceived. He could show, too, that the forged document could not have been written when it claimed to be, for reasons of ink and paper that the sealed and dated ledgers helped to establish beyond dispute. And the ledger's record of Warren's first forgery, 40 years before, the dead partner and the disputed claim that had made the honest assayer seal his office established the pattern past any doubt. This was a man who had built his whole life, from his first youth to his gray age, on exactly this one crime, committed twice, 40 years apart, against the 2 people who had trusted him most. It came apart slowly for Warren Denton, the way justice comes, but it came apart completely. The partnership document was proven a forgery. The ranch and the water rights were restored to Clara Denton, her father's true and only heir. And the forgery, once proven, reopened the question of Amos Denton's convenient death, and though a 2-year-old poisoning is a hard thing to prove, the weight of the forgery and the pattern and the attempt on Clara's own life bore down on Warren Denton until the structure of his respectability collapsed, and the hired man who had left Clara on the trail, faced with a charge of attempted murder, and offered his life if he told the truth, told it, and told more than Clara's story, told what he knew of Amos Denton's death as well. Warren Denton did not die a respectable man in his brother's chair. He died in a territorial prison, and Clara did not go to see it, for she had learned from her father that justice is not the same as vengeance, and that a person is not made whole by watching another destroyed, but only by the truth being told and the wrong being righted. She took back the ranch, 19 years old, and 2 weeks past crawling into a dead town to die. Clara Denton came home to the range her father had built and the water that made it live, and she ran it well, for she was Amos Denton's daughter and she had his eye for land and his patience, and now, hard won in the desert, a strength of her own that nothing would ever take from her again. The first thing she did, coming home, was to stand a long while in the doorway of the house that should always have been hers, the house where she had eaten 2 years at her uncle's sufferance and watched him sit in her father's chair. It was a strange thing to own it now, to walk through its rooms as their mistress, and she found she felt no triumph in it, only a quiet settling, as of a thing put right that should never have been wrong. She had her father's chair carried out to the porch where the morning sun reached it, and she sat in it sometimes in the early light and looked out over the range he had built, and she talked to him, in her mind, and told him it was done, that the truth had come out at last, that the wrong was righted. She hired good men and paid them fair, for she had learned in 2 hard years what it was to be at the mercy of a man who thought people were things to be used, and she would not run her father's ranch that way. She restored her father's name, which Warren's crime had shadowed, and saw to it that the country knew Amos Denton had been what he always was, an honest man murdered by his brother, and not the fool who had signed his daughter's birthright away. And she was, in the years after, known through that dry country as a rancher of uncommon steadiness, a woman who had walked out of the desert with nothing and built back everything, and who could not, ever, be moved by a threat. For she had already faced the worst a man could do to her and crawled out the other side of it alive. She did one thing more, in the years after, that the country remembered. The dead town of Contention, and the sealed Assay office that had saved her, she did not forget. She went back, once she was able, and she saw the assayer's office cared for, the honest man's records preserved, and she saw that the story of it was written down and kept, how an assayer's stubborn honesty, sealing his books against a forgery he could not live to prove, had reached 40 years across time to prove another forgery and save another cheated heir, as though the honest dead had kept faith with the honest living across all those years of dust and silence. For that was the thing that stayed with Clara Denton all her life, the thing she told her own children in time, that an honest record, kept faithfully, does not die when the man who kept it dies, nor when the town he kept it in dies, but waits, patient and true, for the day its truth is needed. She had been 19 years old, and left for dead on the trail, with nothing, and she had crawled into a dead town to find water, and found instead a sealed door that gave her back her life, her father's name, and everything that had been stolen from her. She had not spent $1. She had spent something more. But when her children asked her, in the years after, whether she was sorry for the hard road that had brought her there, she would tell them no, and mean it, for the trail that was meant to kill her had led her to the one door in all the world that held her uncle's ruin. And there are worse things than to be left for dead by a wicked man, if being left for dead is what carries you to the truth. There is a thing worth carrying out of a story like this one, and it is not the ranch restored, though that was justice. It is that honesty is a kind of message sent forward into time, from people we will never meet, meant for a day they will never see. A nameless assayer in a dying town, 40 years before Clara Denton was born, chose to seal his honest books against a lie, rather than let them be tampered or lost, and he died, and his town died, and his careful honest work sat in the dark for 40 years seeming to matter to no one. And then a girl left for dead crawled through a sealed door, and his faithfulness reached out and saved her. We none of us know who will one day need the truth we keep. We only know that a truth kept honestly is never wasted, though it wait a lifetime in the dark. So we will leave you tonight with a question, and we do read every answer. Has there ever been a moment in your own life when something an honest stranger did, long before you were born, reached forward across the years and helped you when you most needed it? Tell us in the comments below. Light a lantern with us, subscribe if this story kept you company tonight, and we will see you down the line, where the next story is already waiting in the dark.